Welcome. I'm Melissa Bell, CNN's correspondent here in Paris. We are delighted, as each year, to be here at the Paris Peace Forum, and specifically this year to be addressing such an important question. The point of this next panel is artificial intelligence, the decade of transformation that we expect, and the perils and promises that that holds. And I think I probably speak for all of you, but perhaps not when I speak for myself, that we have a sense that this is all going to be transformative, but we don't know necessarily that much about it. And I'm really glad that we have a bunch of people who know a lot about it, not least Stanley Chan, who is my first guest, and who is a writer, a columnist, a screenwriter, and who specializes in imagining the future and the impacts that artificial intelligence are going to have on it, and all of the intersections, therefore, between what AI is going to change and how that's going to impact our lives. And for the time being, a lot of that, of course, is down to the imagination of people like Stanley Chan. I'd just like to introduce you. So Stanley, we're very happy to hear from you, not least for the reasons I just explained. Generally, our lack of knowledge, maybe not just for laymen, but just generally, the world doesn't really know what to expect. You worked for a long time for big tech, Baidu, Google China. You know it from the inside, from the corporate sense, what these big tech companies are doing and what's happening with AI, but you've been a full-time writer since 2017. When one considers the future, and you've looked ahead as far as sort of 2041, one imagines, I suppose, something fairly bleak, something fairly inhuman, something led by computers and artificial intelligence that is, by definition, therefore, beyond our control. Is it necessarily bleak, I guess, is my first question.
Yeah, I mean, before I joined the tech companies, I always, sci-fi fan since kid. I'm always a Trekkie, so live long and prosper. So, yeah, to me, it feels to me a lot of people getting all this bleak imagination about the future from science fiction movies like Terminators, 2001 Space Odyssey, etc., etc. But I think it's a little bit misleading there, and we urgently need some positive and bright imagination about the future, and this is how we can create a better version of the future. So in the book, we basically create 10 stories around the world. So talking about how technology such as AI gonna change and challenging our individual and society, but also human as an individual, we have our agency, we have our autonomy to make the change by learning, by adapting, by capturing all this humanity essential of like feelings and experience to make the change. I think this is what we necessary to build up the framework and change our mindset to doing so by imagination.
But do we not need to understand it to be able to do that? I guess one of the concerns that people naturally have about this field, vast field, is that it is beyond the wit of so many of us already. Is that something that is not an inevitable kind of process?
I mean, it's true because we always feel some kind of fear and anxiety towards something we're not quite familiar with. So this is something deeply embedded in our humanity for long. But I mean, we have to think beyond that because right now you can see this technology is basically co-living with us, coexisting with us. It's changing us. Meanwhile, we're changing it reversely. So I think we have to think it in a very symbiotic way, just like Taoism. Everything is interconnected, everything is interwoven. Just we are one of the many kinds of different intelligence on this planet. So we have to learn how to co-live with it in a harmonious way. So this is what I think we should think beyond fear and favor binary.
And the changes that you've been busy imagining as a writer are profound. There's no realm of human action or interaction that won't be impacted. Is it possible really to imagine already? Do we have an idea already of what to expect?
I think we're making progress. Even it's so difficult because we were trapped in this human body. We think in a very human-centric manner. I think yeah, sometimes we might need to use AI as an interface to help us to think beyond human. So this is what I'm so interested in AI translation, not only between human different languages, but also non-human, like animals, plants, and fungi. Maybe on someday we can have this interspecies communication, and then we can understand more about the world we're living in.
What was it that made you decide to look at this, I suppose, through art? Because you had been involved in the technology corporate side of it. What was the interest to you, the attraction of being able to explore as an artist this field?
I mean, I started to build my own language model like 6 years ago, 2017, when the year Google launched a transformer and published a very important paper, Attention is All You Need. And back in the day, we don't have ChatGPT, and we just built up with CNN and LSTM, convolutional neural network, and a long short-term memory. So it's very preliminary, and it's just create some murmuring, nonsense, avant-garde style prose, but you have to create the content around it to make it sensible. But even though it helped me to win a literature prize in China, and juried by another AI, written in totally different language. And I won the first prize of the prize, and the second place was the Nobel Prize winner on literature, Mr. Mo Yan.
Wow, amazing. And what is the capacity of AI to replace artists? Because you make a good point about things that I suppose we're nearly at a point now, I guess, where AI is going to be sort of self-transformative, and artificial intelligence is going to, the leaps and bounds that it comes on. At what point is it capable, I suppose, of writing, of art, of what is most human?
I think AI is capable of doing a lot of things. It can summarize a lot of things. It can collect a lot of data and make it logical, connect the dots. But I think there's something still missing there. Is irreplaceable, like human experience, especially our embodied experience, and our memories, because right now AI have very short-term time window on remembering things. And I think all of this make me to reflect on my own writing process. So right now I'm doing my writing in a very non-linear manner. So I'll separate different layers, even modules, and separate which part is better to do with AI, which parts belong to myself. And it makes you to feel you have to be more creative and going back to human essence to be more emotional, to grab your perception of the world and use your maybe childhood memory and dig deeper in your humanity, etc., etc. So it's making you a better creator, basically, if you use it in a smarter way. So I totally understand a lot of people use it in a lazier way, so that makes them stupid, I think.
But actually, your point is that it can also drive us to think about what is most human that we have, that no computer can replace.
Yes, I think AI is basically an interface, but it's just like a mirror. When you're talking to it, it just makes you see yourself. You look deeper into yourself, and you realize human, basically, we are an interface of language and a lot of different perceptions as well. So we're just absorbing all these data sets from our past, from our family, from the surroundings, for everything. So you have to think about how we can optimize and cultivate our interface to make us a better human being.
Just before we bring on the other guests for this panel, Stanley, but just on a personal level, what are you most excited about in terms of, and we're going to talk a minute about where the technology is, what's next, and how quickly what's next going to come? What's exciting about it?
As a creator, as a storyteller, I'm quite excited about how capable I can use AI to be across the boundary. So because I'm a writer, I write in text, but now I can create some short films, some imageries. Maybe I can do a whole feature movie all by myself. It used to be you have to have a whole team, like hundreds of thousands of people to finish the work. But maybe in the future, you could be the director, you could be the musician, you can be anything you want to be. So this kind of, democratizing of like creative power is belongs to everyone. Everyone could be a great storyteller with the help, with the empower of AI. So this is what I'm excited about.
Amazing. Stanley Chan, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, Melissa.
Thank you. I'd just like to call our other panelists up to the stage, and I'll give you a brief introduction in a second. Thank you. I'm going to give you a brief introduction as everyone seats themselves, and I'm going to try and do it in order. We have just to the left of Stanley, we have Brad Smith, who's the vice chair and president of Microsoft, and who has a fascinating job, which I'm looking forward to hearing more about. You spearhead a bunch of the company's projects in terms of precisely that, the interface between AI and a number of different issues, whether it's human rights, societal issues. And so it's a pretty fancy title, and Brad's going to tell us more about it in just a second. After, we have also with us Gabriela Ramos, who's the Assistant Director General for the Social and Human Sciences of UNESCO, and is very much at the helm of efforts that are being made in terms of the sort of frameworks that we're going to be talking about, how the world goes about regulating, organizing, thinking about this together to face the perils and the promises. We have also immediately to the left of Gabriela, we have Ian Bremmer, who is the founder and president of the Eurasia Group. But of course, you'll know him mainly through his writings, but also, oh, sorry, no, sorry, I went too fast. Ian Bremmer is to the far left of Yann Lequin, first of all, I'm sorry, who is the vice president and chief AI scientist of Meta, and in fact described as one of the godfathers of the thing. So we look forward to hearing about more exactly how everything that even now we take for granted was created by one of the men who is actually responsible. And to his left, then, Ian Bremmer, that most of you will know from his writings. He's a political scientist who specializes very much, again, in the intersection between AI, its possibility, and what that's going to mean for public policy and world governance and practically anything you'd care to name. And then to his left, we are delighted to welcome Zeynep Tufekci, who is a techno-sociologist, a global tech thinker, and I think one of the leading academics in all of the fields that I've just mentioned. So thank you, first of all, for being with us. I'd like to start, first of all, with Stanley, and then maybe move down the line with all of you. To us laymen, I think one of the questions that poses itself is exactly what AI is capable of now, like where we are, and what we're on the cusp of. So what is, I'd like you each maybe to give us an idea of what AI is capable of, and what the next thing is that we should be looking ahead, what it's going to be capable of next. Stanley, if you would.
I think just I mentioned it is capable of many things, but all these experts must know more than I do, but something is incapable is improvisation, I would say. So as a human creator, you know, sometimes your inspiration came randomly, but you couldn't see this in AI-generated contents. It's very static and stiff sometimes, and you feel lack of some human touch. So this is
now it's limit.
For now, yeah, still, yeah. So I'm still feeling safe for now. Yeah.
Your job is assured. Brad.
Well, I would say a couple of things. I mean, first of all, I think the best way to know what it's capable of now is simply to use it. And yeah, I would guess there's a number of people who in the past year have used ChatGPT or similar services from others. And fundamentally what people have seen is it's now very capable of answering questions or responding to prompts and generating content that provides information and insight for people, and creating, including creating things that would qualify in the eyes of some as creative writing. But I think people really want to know where's it going, and yeah, I think people should assume that every year throughout this decade it will become more capable, and you can have a lively debate about how much more capable it will become. And I would say to some degree you can assume it will. It'll be impressive, and nobody has the perfect crystal ball, but there's a lot of optimism. I think that the other thing one should just think about is that while everybody's really focused on things like the models, what we're going to see is just this I think, very positive development of many applications. Applications that use these models, applications that use narrower or open source models, applications that use what are called fine-tuned models, meaning there are models within an organization that are fine-tuned on your own data. But fundamentally, there'll be applications that help you do something. And there will be many applications at some level. You may well find in 2 years that every application on your smartphone is in some ways using AI to do whatever it does better than it does today.
Gabriella, picking up from that, so there are going to be all these practical applications and our lives will be made easier by it. But for the time being, it's very difficult to know how all of this is being regulated, and it is institutions like yours that are beginning to think about that. If you could give us an idea.
Yes, and thank you for framing it like that, because I see that I'm surrounded by technologists and some that are looking at the governance. I have to say that if you discuss this issue as a technological issue, you get trapped. Because then you're talking about how the technology works, how can we use it, how it enhances our possibilities of doing analysis in a very fast manner, generative AI, learning by itself, applications that are just amazing in cases of disasters or in cases of health, but it's not a technological discussion, because we know also that these same capabilities that it has to do good can be also disastrous when it's used to influence negatively your democratic processes, or used to manipulate people or to lure children to do things that they should not be doing. And therefore, this is not a technological discussion, it's a societal one. It's to steer. We have the capabilities of the users, the governments have the duty to steer this technological revolution so that the downsides are not emerging as they are now, and the good sides are also there. So I feel it's a question of what kind of ethical framework do we put for these technologies to deliver for good.
I'd like for a moment with Jan, who, as I described, is very much, and since the 1980s, one of those who's helped AI to develop to where it is. Maybe you could tell us, take us back to the technology for a moment. What is the next big thing that it is capable of? What should we be excited about?
Yeah, of course, there's a lot of things that AI can do today that are very beneficial in, saving lives, in driving assistance for cars, analyzing images, medical images, and helping designing new drugs and things like this, and helping make people more creative. Getting aid, essentially, and catalyzes creativity. Same thing for music and audio, images, video, coming soon. But those systems are currently very limited. So the idea somehow that because an AI system like ChatGPT and other chatbots can pass the bar exam, somehow they've reached human intelligence. That's just not true at all. Those systems are extremely stupid. They don't understand how the world works. They can regurgitate information they've been trained on, which is all public data. And they can adapt it to the situation you're asking them, but they can't really invent anything at the moment. They can't reason. They can't plan. They don't really understand the physical world, as I was saying. So to some extent, according to some measures of intelligence, your house cat is smarter than the smartest of the AI systems that we have today.
That's amazing, but that is going to change.
That is going to change. So a lot of us are working on essentially the next generation of AI systems that would be capable of remembering, which current LLMs can't, reasoning, planning, using tools, interacting in the world, acting in the world. This is going to produce a completely new set of potential applications, which will profoundly transform the way we work or we get entertained.
Does the technology escape us at one point?
Okay, that's a broader discussion, but no. So if we try to project the current systems that we have at our disposal, the large language models, and we just imagine that we extrapolate, they become smarter and smarter without really changing the blueprint that they are built around. We might be worried about the fact that they would escape our control because the current systems are not controllable. Many of you, I'm sure, have played with it. They hallucinate facts that are not true. If you prompt them in a particular way, they will do things that they really were not designed to do. They will escape, if you want, their training to some extent. So those systems are not controllable. If we imagine that those systems are capable of reaching human intelligence, then that possibly would be dangerous. But I personally do not believe for 1 second that the current systems can reach human intelligence just by scaling up and training them on more data. We're going to need a system that has a new type of blueprint, and that blueprint will make them controllable. They will basically be driven by objectives that we set for them. And so if they have to abide by those objectives, they'll be controllable. They're not going to escape or control.
Ian, to you, picking up on Jan's point just there, which is really interesting, the idea that to get to a generation of AI that will be not necessarily threatening, but sort of self-creating, is going to take a whole different blueprint. There is a need at some point for governments, public policymakers, global organizations to be able to understand the technology, to get ahead of it before that happens.
So I definitely want to talk about that. But I think for where we are in the conversation right now, I think a really interesting point is that AI, it's a very safe bet to say that AI is going to change a hell of a lot faster in the coming few years than our existing institutions and structures. So that interplay is really important. So understanding first where we think AI is going to go should be the principal thing. And my involvement, for example, with the United Nations has been about, let's just get analytic capacity globally to understand where it's going. Two different components I find really interesting. One really optimistic, one really pessimistic. One, for example, is that one of the reasons I'm very excited about AI is because unlike a lot of new technologies that intrinsically displace very powerful actors in their ability to use them, the first way that AI makes an impact on the global economy is it allows incumbents to take AI and reduce waste and create more efficiency and create more productivity with their existing institutions. And when institutions are stickier than AI, that gives you a lot of lift. That excites me a lot in different sectors. The thing that really worries me, I agree with Jan. I mean, I think we're very, very far away from, house cats can be smarter than human beings, to be fair, but we're very, very far from AI being able to have the kind of general intelligence that we really consider to matter. But very soon, right now, AI is training these generative models on the corpus of human data all out there. And we all know the problems, we know the hallucinations, we know the data issues. But as Brad said, we're going to get a lot of impact that come from training on more private data. And some of that is going to be sectoral and scientific, and that's exciting. But for me, the biggest transition is when it's training on your personal data, all of your personal data. Right? Because, that's when it's going to be useful to you. And by the way, very biased, lots of disinformation, but your biases and your personal disinformation. And I think that AI, in that regard, the ability of AI to change us, not because AI is so much smarter, but rather because we are programmable. Right? Algorithms can affect human beings. And I deeply worry not about AGI changing the planet, but rather about individually trained AI making human beings less human, making us interact more with it, which is an extension of us, a mirror of us, as opposed to society as a whole. We already see kids doing that.
That's kind of happening already.
Exactly. But if you take that and say, society's not going to change that fast, institutions and governance aren't going to change that fast, but AI training on your data and everything that you have on your smartphone is coming within the next 3 years, then that interplay is one of the most interesting things out there. That for me is the way to answer your question.
Zainab, some of your thoughts on where we are and what comes next and what worries you, what excites you?
Okay, so I should start by redirecting perhaps a little bit, because it doesn't have to be smarter than human beings whatsoever to have a major transformative effect. In fact, I find that discussion somewhat irrelevant to many things. It's interesting. I started in computer science. I love reading science fiction, so I find that part interesting. But it doesn't really, I don't think it's important. Cheetahs run faster than us, so what? And there are some people smarter than other people. So that is not really the key thing. The key thing, to go back to like the earlier technological transformations, the printing press didn't make it, the printing press also printed words that people could write by hand. So that didn't change. What changed was it was available at scale, cheaper. And that is very often overlooked, to have something be faster, to have something be at scale, have something be much cheaper. That is the core transformation of most technological revolutions. It's not that they do something better than a single individual or they play chess better than something like that. And to sort of go back to, once again, printing press, telegraph, all those things, people did speak. You just had to put the mail in a, envelope and put it on a horse. But once you can do this over the air, that is a major transformative thing. So to give us an example of, I use facial recognition because it's an easy one. Computers don't have to be better than a human at facial recognition. We don't care about that, really. People are very good at human, facial recognition. But the fact that if I wanted to sort of facially recognize someone as a government, I could hire 1 million people to look at 1 million photos, but that's not really practical. But once I can do it automatically and at scale, and there are cameras everywhere, and there's this facial recognition thing, and all of a sudden we have completely lost the ability to be anonymous in public. Now that's the major transformation. So to go back to the AI, what is AI going to do, or most of the large language models, machine learning? I think it's already dramatically transforming a lot of things. And they will be deployed if it goes like everything else has been. And I don't see why it would be any different. They will be used both for decision making and for interacting with, institutions, governments, the sort of the chat version of that, the language models. And I think it will be largely consequential in potentially not so great ways if we don't do it a little different than the way we've been doing and try to understand the consequences. It's not like studying the little thing, the consequences in the society-wide. There's a lot of these downsides. Am I an optimist? Of course I'm an optimist, because why would you be a critic if you were not an optimist? But to give another example that is one of my favorite ones, is that even the printing press was so destabilizing that it was hundreds of years of war and death. And now we wouldn't say the printing press is bad, but we would say the transition was deeply destabilizing, and arguably in Europe was settled with the European Union. I would put that as those 400 years to be that transition. And it was only after really genuine, not AGI, but genuine existential fears with nuclear weapons, with the Holocaust, that the world kind of, 2 world wars, we kind of came to our senses and stopped some of the terrible things by building the EU, interdependence, all of those things. So I'm hoping this time the transition, we don't wait till the destabilization, which it will happen, is so far into the process that we're just sort of running around in a panic, and try to anticipate and measure and control, rather than debating, is it good, is it bad? I don't really like, of course it's good, of course it's bad. I see those things as less productive given the urgency.
More sterile. I'd love, Brad, you to pick up on that, maybe the idea of these very transformative, and as Zeynep just explained it, the sort of the scale of it, the speed of it, the transformative quality of it across everything that we do as human beings. Who's in charge of that? Like right now, it's big tech. I guess governments are trying to get a handle on it, but it's difficult. How do we navigate that huge revolutionary change that she mentions without it being chaos and blood and destruction for hundreds of years?
Well, I think fundamentally what it requires is that innovation and governance move forward together. And people can debate what will move faster. Let's just assume innovation moves faster than governance, but if governance can move more quickly, it can stay within a reasonable distance, and staying within a reasonable distance is definitely better than the opposite. And then you just have to decide, well, what is your definition of good governance? And I think it starts in part by identifying the problems that people are worried about and they want to solve. And you see governments do that. You see the EU doing that with the AI Act and a focus on threats to privacy or, say, the safety of children or civil liberties and the like. You see the US and the UK doing that. And they are very focused on things like safety and security. And safety, I think, is fundamentally the risk that a model will perform in an unanticipated or unintended way as part of its normal use. Security, I think, is fundamentally the risk that third parties will intentionally use AI to inflict harm on other humans, such as through creating a biological weapon. And ultimately, I think we're going to need a global governance framework. And if you look at the world of safety, of security, of a lot of these other areas, we do live in a world where there is a level of global governance for many things, and we shouldn't forget that. And I think in the areas that are most analogous, it fundamentally has three tiers. The foundational tier is usually some level of technical standards. That is where experts who work in the field tend to define things that everybody can agree on as to how to measure harms, how to mitigate them. To some degree, it may relate to the process that is used to develop the products in the first place. Then you have national rules as a second tier, and then you have global coordination as a third. And I think it's really easy to look at the world today and say, oh my gosh, we can't do that. This is no longer the 1940s. There's no longer a global consensus on anything. But the one thing I would say is people probably came here in one of three ways. You either came here locally because you live in Paris and you came in a car or the metro or walked. You came from perhaps another city in Europe, in which case you took a train, or you came from farther away and you were on an airplane. Take the last for a moment. Despite all of the disagreements in the world today, we still live in a world where you can get on a plane in one country and get off it in another country, and the one thing you know for certain, nobody can change that plane while it's in flight. So it took a global coordinated regulatory structure to ensure that planes can be built in one country, they can be sold in another, airlines can fly them across borders. That's just one example of many where I think we have the opportunity to learn and apply some of these things that seem most relevant to the governance structure we need for AI.
And that, Gabriel, is exactly what you're doing at UNESCO. Tell us a little bit about that.
I'm hearing these voices in terms of how much regulators are always trying to catch up with technological developments. I agree with that, but I have to say, with no false modesty, that UNESCO in 2021 already developed a global consensus on building this ethically. And when we did that, we was in the middle of, my God, are they crazy? They're going to shoot themselves in the foot. Because the narrative was that any regulation will hinder innovation. And because we are with multiple objectives, and countries, of course, want to control the downside, but countries also want to be at the leading edge, and they want to be the ones that receive more investments and do more startups. And therefore, you have policymakers with these competing objectives. But what we were proud of is that we made a very simple question. What do we want the technologies for? And that doesn't bring you to the technological issues of how you control with an algorithm or you do. That brings you to the problems and the challenges that we have as humanities and how the technologies can help us to solve that. We live in very divided societies. We live with high inequalities. We try to achieve the climate transition. We're trying to advance gender equality. And so the real question is, are technologies helping us to do that? And therefore, what we achieve at UNESCO, and this is the wonderful, I brought it because, of course, I wanted you all to see it. This is a recommendation. And with the gender face, of course, with the women's face. The point is, we have a human rights and human dignity frameworks. We have gender equality objectives. We have sustainability objectives. Therefore, those should be the guidelines, the compass to develop these technologies. And then when you are in a lab and you are developing whatever technology, you should not ask yourself, oh, my data, optimizing, maximizing, and being effective, but to say, is this really helping me to narrow those gaps? And let's just remember, because we also talk about global is changing our life, is going to transform the reality of everybody. Well, no, because half of the world is not connected or doesn't have access to stable internet. Second point, how you translate those values that are so important into something concrete. And that's why I'm also very proud about this governance framework. Because we said, okay, you need to have the principles of transparency, accountability, all of those that you know, that is just the rule of law. If something goes wrong, somebody has to be responsible and somebody has to be compensated for the harm, which is not so straightforward in the digital space. And then all of this needs to go down to policies, legislation. And we were asked by our member countries, 193 that signed to that, to develop a tool to measure where countries are and where they want to be, because some countries are risk takers, like the US. Some countries in Europe are less bound to take risk, and therefore we just measure them. We're working with 50 countries now. I had this morning in the General Conference at UNESCO, Senegal, Chile, Morocco, Brazil, who came to exchange their practices. And therefore, I feel that this is the question of how do we shape the environment in which these technologies are being put with policies, with institutions, with investment. Final point, I really think that we can shape these markets. I have heard before, we cannot shape them because they're so fast, you don't even understand them. I was in the UK AI Safety Summit. The fact is that you can do it because the governments have the tools, not only regulations, investment, taxes, procurement, and the fact is that we just need to do it. The conversation changed with the US executive order, and I'm happy about that because it's not about the technologies.
And very recently, this was May we're talking about, but I'd like to take that question of the natural inbuilt inequality that the world faces, without the consequences it'll have, maybe with Ian just afterwards. But first of all, Jan, I just wanted to, just at that point, that it's about intention and that fear, that intuitive fear that so many of us have, that the changes are so fast and coming purely from a technological ability point of view. Talk us through that. The fact that this can be reined in and used for good, or that it is beyond the control of policymakers already, and how fast it's going.
Well, from the technological point of view and the human point of view, people sometimes feel threatened by the fact that at some point in the future, AI system will be smarter than us. There's no question this will happen, right? We have to get used to this idea. Machines will get smarter than us in all the domains where we are smart, and probably in other domains that we can't even fathom. So we have to get used to this idea. Now, do we feel threatened by this, or do we feel empowered by it? If those systems are under our control, then that's empowering. It makes us more creative, more efficient, smarter in general ways. And that's really empowering. Many of us here are leaders in business, academia, government. We have people working for us who are smarter than us. I only hire people who are smarter than me. And that makes us perform better, right? I mean, that's... So in the future, we'll have assistants with us all the time that will not be necessarily only people, but also machines that will be smarter than us. And we shouldn't feel threatened by this as long as those systems are under our control. So we set their goals, their objectives, and they work for us. They make us smarter. Now, I agree with what, I know what your name, what Zeynep said about,
See, we all need to get smarter.
Yes, right. about the analogy with the printing press. It could be that the printing press, of course, disrupted society in Europe and beyond, but eventually led to the Enlightenment, to democracy, to the French Revolution, the American Revolution, and changed the world for the better, made people more educated, more aware of what was going on. So we might witness a new renaissance due to AI in the future, and we want to make this a new renaissance. And I agree that we need to deal with, figure out how to minimize the bad side effects, absolutely. Because there's going to be some, it's inevitable, but minimize the disruption in some ways. So that's where governance comes in. But there is, I think, in that respect, one point that is very important, which is that imagine a future 10, 20 years from now, where every single one of our interactions with the digital world is mediated by an AI system. So we'll have assistants with us all the time that we can ask questions to, talk to, that will remind us of things. Like a human assistant, but a human assistant is smarter than us. We cannot afford those systems to be proprietary systems controlled by a handful of companies.
Just before I take that to the end of the road, I just wanted to ask you, Stanley, in the world that you imagine, who's in control of the world? Is it systems that are beyond our control, or does it remain people?
I mean, in my imagination, it will be interwoven. So at certain point, like just Jan mentioned, there'll be interface in the intermediate, our conversation, our communication, all this information exchange. So at certain point, it's kind of like I have this kind of feeling where basically symbiosis, where like it's like the constantly influence of like interconnected with each other. So you couldn't tell. So without yin, there's no yang. Without yang, there's no yin. So it's interchangeable. And I always have this reflection, maybe I'm another kind of ChatGPT. Not because we're sharing the same birthday, but we're basically the interface of like exchanging information and data.
Ian and Zainab, I'd love you to pick up on the points. Jan, sorry, you wanted to add?
Yeah, I wanted to finish the thread that I started. So we cannot afford to have those systems which will basically constitute a repository of all human knowledge and culture be controlled by a small number of companies. This will become an infrastructure of the world, but the cultural and knowledge infrastructure of the world, a little bit like the internet today. If the infrastructure of the internet today was proprietary, it wouldn't be the internet. If it was controlled by a couple of phone companies, for example. And it could have happened this way. But in the end, the internet became a global infrastructure, completely delocalized, runs entirely on open source software. AI has to be the same way. AI will become a common platform and will have to be open source in particular, because that's the only way that we can have people around the world contribute to training it so that it becomes a repository of all human knowledge. I'm taking the French government because I've talked to them quite a bit, but the French government will not accept that every citizen's interaction with the digital world is entirely controlled by a few companies on the west coast of the US. It's just too dangerous culturally, politically, for everything. So this will have to be delocalized and open. There's no other option. So I think the biggest danger that we have in the short term is that somehow, because perhaps of regulations, because of fears, which in my opinion are irrational at this point, the technology will be locked, behind lock and key, so that it's not open anymore. And that's a very big short-term danger, I think.
But steps have been taken against that. ChatGPT is one, Meta also.
ChatGPT is entirely closed.
Well, Meta is owned by shareholders. OpenAI is owned by a nonprofit. Which would you have more confidence in? Getting your technology from a nonprofit or a for-profit company that is entirely controlled by one human being?
Regardless of who owns it, there is one that is open, the other one is closed.
No, it all depends on your definition of open.
If it's open, anybody can use it. Anybody can use it for whatever they want. And it belongs to the world now. So there's a big difference between the two. That's independent of whether the owner is a for-profit or non-profit.
Can I just sort of say, this is the wrong open-closed discussion in my view. Like, there are corporate interests in where the data comes from, and I may even agree with you on that. But when we say open as human beings, we don't mean open source, open data necessarily. Those things are not what gives the openness, because even if you had because of the way these things work, even if you had all the data and all the things, it is not open. We do not understand. These are black boxes. When we talk about open, in everyday language, we mean we understand that there's transparency, and no amount of open source, even if you agree with open source, gives you the kind of transparency you need for democratic, accountable control of these things. So I think corporations with interest, and sometimes right arguments that I even agree with, are discussing open closed as if that's what we, the people, mean by open and closed, and that's not what we mean. And when we say, will people control it, I would like to say the key question isn't people versus machines, it's which people. Is it corporations, is it governments, or is it democratically elected, accountable institutions of governance versus, because we know the people aren't one thing. There are people in power, there are wealthy people, and there are people whose only power is to vote. So my question would be, which people control it is more important than people versus AI.
Ian, to those points.
A lot of views on this. I think it is too soon to tell whether or not we're going to be in a happy place on AI in 3 to 5 years. I think I want to be hopeful, and there are a lot of reasons to be hopeful. But the backdrop, geopolitically, of the world right now is towards fragmentation. The backdrop is towards more conflict. The backdrop is right now towards more inequality, actually. And if AI is being injected into that system and is unable by itself to transform it, then I suspect you're going to get a magnifying impact of that. Now look, Stanley talked about a symbiosis. I love the idea of a symbiosis, but I also know systems that feel much more host-parasite, even though we think they're symbiotic. And that's absolutely plausible, depending on who's in charge and who's calling the shots, right? I mean, I love Jan's concept of, I'm smart, I only hire people that are smarter than me. That's awesome. Does that describe everyone in your organization? Are you freaking kidding me? No, not even close. So the idea that you can say, well, it's just fine because it's going to be smarter, we'll just hire smarter people. No one in an organization thinks that you only hire smarter people. There are enormous problems in corporations and in governments with B and C and D players that refuse to hire competent people, that sideline competent people. That's exactly the way we work. It's not like Jan, okay? I mean, maybe he actually does operate like that, and God bless him if he does, but most people don't. So, you know, clearly. Now, I thought that Bletchley was very interesting because here we had a major stage, and you had a whole bunch of government actors. It was like the G20, except you also had a whole bunch of technology actors. And there was no difference in terms of where they were standing on the stage. AI is kind of a post-Westphalian moment. I mean, what I call a technopolar world, because when you look at the digital environment, when you look at AI specifically, it is the companies that are making the decisions. It is the companies that are determining the outcomes. And the only way that governance is going to get done in that environment, unless you nationalize the corporates, which the Americans hate, you know, or the corporates take over, which Zeynep should hate because they don't have social contracts and they're not responsible to citizens, you're going to have something that's hybrid. You're going to have something that's actually very unlike everything that we have had heretofore. And you know, we learned a little bit about that in science fiction. I mean, the Ministry of the Future was a little bit of like a hybrid of like technocrats with whatever power they could find around the world, creating something supranationally governable, because the only way you could deal with climate was that. I actually think that Kim Stanley Robinson would have been more intriguing writing that book about AI than about climate. But anyway, those are a few thoughts.
Yeah, Gabriella, on to that point, I think it's a really interesting one that
yes,
that hybrid world that Ian mentions, and that's impossible to imagine right now.
No, the whole point, what I'm hearing here is, I was also in London, and I think that the conversation changed. And it changed by a single move by the US, which came with the executive order saying, we need ex-ante assessments, which looks like obvious, but it's obvious. You need to test the systems before they reach the market, which is not always the rule. So I feel that we need to be conscious that there has been a very unbalanced distribution of power in these things because we let the companies alone. The governments decided to let the companies alone. They decided to invest more in innovation. And now, because of generative AI, which has caused all these questions of existential risk, and they are taking control, and they're... But the conversation in London was not only about existential risk. Was about biases, was about algorithms, was about the way we treat data that is not representative, but more than anything was a reaffirmation that the governments have the duty of care and that they should be doing something about it.
And Zainab, can we trust them? Is that enough?
Well, I do want to sort of say, we have regulated many complex, advanced things before. I mean, the idea that this is something new that we've never done is absolutely false. The reason we feel like that is when it works, we don't see it, we don't feel it, because it works. I like Brad's example, like airplanes being as safe as they are and operating globally is a very complicated achievement. Like if you ever read, this is what an optimist does. I read all the crash reports, the no blame investigations. In fact, I feel so good about reading them. Once I was reading one on a plane and my seatmate was getting a little uneasy and I had to say, no, I do this for a living. It makes me feel great because they go through every little thing and they go through the human side, they go through this, they go through this, they find the problem, they fix it. So I give a lot of examples. The fact that you can go into a supermarket or a market anywhere in the world and eat some food and that you do not expect to be poisoned, and that if you are, that is a scandal, that there's a failure. Have you seen the sort of food chain regulation? It's incredibly complex, and it used to kill people, like by the hundreds and dozens when we moved to mass urbanization. You look at cars, right? We have now electric cars and low emission cars, and it was California started changing the rules, and then everybody was saying, oh, this is impossible, and it pulled the world. There are, I mean, I can go on for hours on very complicated things. Germany and France aren't going to war every 20 years. That is, whatever its failings, the European Union is a pinnacle of human achievement and institutions that within one generation, and within living memory of the worst 2 global wars we have seen, people were like traveling back and forth without borders. Like it took half a generation to get there. So we have regulated complex things. We have regulated entrenched things. We used to have lead in paint because lead is a great anti-corrosive. Lead is great. Lead is useful. We had it. We used it for good reason. But at some point, the world said the price of poisoning children like this is not worth it, and we took it all down. We took it all down at great cost, so even if it's entrenched. So I feel like we have done this so many times, and AI is interesting, and it will do all sorts of things. And as for like finding AI to hire smart people, and once again, like I believe Jan does it, I do. We always like have these very productive arguments, so I feel like he does like that kind of back and forth. But what I think might happen is that AI will be used to not hire people, I don't know, who might unionize the place, or who might be prone to chronic depression but are not now, but the AI can infer that. People who might be prone to becoming pregnant in the next year but are not now, AI can infer that. It can be used to shape the population to corporate interests. And in the case of governments, it can be used for very authoritarian ways because governments do that. And that's why I don't even see governments running the whole thing as an in and end of itself. It is the people with democracy and accountability and transparency that we have this conversation, we discuss the technical things, and as a society, we don't just let either corporations or governments with their interests in surveillance and control and whatever else they think, and that will be the true open and accountable rather than, you know, is the source open or not, which, you know, there are good arguments there, but that's, I think, the future we should want. And if we manage that, what will happen is in 20, 30 years, they'll be like, this is so complex, you know, we forgot about it because it will work. If it works, we will not see it because we've done this before. When it works, we no longer see it.
Yeah, and I'm going to open it up in a second, but just picking up on what was just said, the point is, though, most people, and I include myself, don't understand it enough to be able to take control of it. And that'll probably be the case. There'll be this inbuilt inequality in our ability as human beings to access it, to use it, to be part of it. And there's very little anyone can do about that. Jan, I'd love your thoughts on that.
So a remark on this, there are studies that have been done in the last few months where you take people who are really good at what they do, you give them an LLM, and then you get people who are not so good at what they do, the same thing, you give them an LLM. It makes the people who are not very good much better, and it makes the people who are good just a little bit better. So it could actually reduce inequality. We don't know, okay? There's more studies that are required. But to the point, I mean, I think I agree with you that regulations are absolutely necessary when it comes to certainly life-critical systems, to products that are put in the hands of the public. And you know, we've had that for everything, and it's not a new thing. And I think we need that for AI-fueled products. We already have that. When an automatic emergency braking system is put in a car, which is required in the EU now, it's an AI system, and you know, it's tested before you can put it on the market. Any medical diagnostic aid, you know, medical image analysis or whatever that's based on AI is tested the same way everything else is tested in medicine. So no problem with this. The main issue I think that I'm really concerned about concerning regulation is that there are talks of regulating research and development. And I think that's extremely counterproductive. There's talks of having a cap on how much compute you can spend to train an AI system. This is research and development. We're not talking about deploying systems. There's, you know, some talks in the executive order of, you know, getting a license before you can train an AI system above a certain power. There's talks that because AI is potentially too dangerous, open source AI systems should be banned, because what do we know what people can do with it? And I think that would be an absolute disaster.
Ian, you wanted to jump in.
Well, just very quickly in terms of what might be a disaster, because I'm sort of the geopolitics guy here. I see the biggest issue on AI as being where the Americans and Chinese will be vis-a-vis each other. There's been a very significant number of US policies on export controls for semiconductors and related parts of supply chain that are significantly constraining China's ability to continue to develop advanced technologies, and would certainly have a massive impact on them in AI. In return, the Chinese are now doing the same thing, starting with gallium and germanium, and that was a little marginal, but now in the last few weeks on graphite, which is absolutely critical to batteries and EV supply chain. We are in an environment where there may well be a decision process between the two largest economies in the world that would get you into a technology Cold War in the two most important new technology sets that are being developed: transition on climate and post-carbon energy, and the development of artificial intelligence. This is intrinsically something we should not want for the development of the planet, for the safety and well-being and future of 8+ billion people here. And I would watch that very, very closely. And France's interests in particular are not necessarily aligned with what we see happening right now between Washington and Beijing.
Brad, would you like to jump in on that sort of, and I've seen Ian describe it as the zero-sum game that Beijing and Washington appear to consider that this is, and their ability to impact that?
Well, look, I think one of the challenging things with this conversation is we're covering in 30 seconds a lot of topics that are each worthy of at least 30 minutes. So I guess I would zoom out a little bit. I mean, to me, I'd go back to, I think it's, what can we all agree on? I think we should all be able to agree on this does need to be governed, and the governance should not be left to the private sector alone. I think that's probably a proposition. I would say, I'd build on Ian's point, but I take it a little bit differently. We're going to need a governance structure that, you know, has real input and data coming from the tech sector, because we're the ones that are building this. But I would argue that the tech sector deserves a voice but shouldn't have a vote. You know, that the real authority, decision-making authority, is best left in the hands of governments that are elected by the people, governments that have territorial authority over their borders. And I would certainly argue that we need to give civil society a real voice as well. And civil society, it cannot have a voice that is effective unless it has access to information. So I think there's going to be certain transparency requirements, as difficult as they are to define, that we're going to need to fashion. I would also say, Jan, I think a lot of the answers, in my view, are it depends. You can imagine a regime that really feels onerous before somebody can go build a new model. Or I could imagine a licensing regime that really requires somebody, if they're going to build something highly capable, to put some safeguards in place first, which is fundamentally where the executive order is going. So, one of the practices that has emerged in 2023 is the notion that if you're having a team that's building a model, you should have a red team that's testing the model, that's looking for the problems that people are worried about. It's emerged that the standard now is the red team needs to be different from, call it the blue team, the team that's building it. You could have a license requirement that says, hey, if you're going to go build something highly capable, you ought to have reasonable cybersecurity protection and physical security protection so that it doesn't go missing in the middle of the night. So, I would say if people apply a level of common sense, you start to develop the ability to weave a lot of these things together. The U.S. will worry about China. China will worry about the U.S. Many in Europe will think that the two are obsessed with each other. We'll all figure out how to navigate this. Neither of those pressures is going to go away. And being in France, I remember what President Macron said at day one, year one for the Paris Peace Forum. We're going to find our own way. And I suspect that's the case too.
I'd love to open it up to questions because I'm conscious of the time passing, if there were any from the audience. I know there's a microphone. Is there a microphone? Mike? I think it's on its way.
Hi there. Thank you so much. Nadara Yusuf from the Simpson Center. Thank you for this panel. It's been really fascinating to listen to. But when you mention global governance, one of the key issues that we have is the asymmetry of governance in different fora, which will induce forum shopping. You're going to have key actors go to the forums where the rules of the game are least inconvenient to what they want to have. Is this where maybe organizations like the United Nations or other international fora come into play? Because some collective action exercise needs to be led here in order to sort of create some baseline. I'd be curious to hear what the panelists think about that.
Gabrielle, maybe to you first and then move down.
I completely agree with you. I think this is this technology is highly concentrated in some actors. Some actors are developing it. The financing, the skills, the infrastructure is not everywhere, but all the world is using this technology. Governments in the global south are buying platforms to run their health systems, to run their education systems. I think that's very risky. I think we need to have the governments also producing their own technologies. But the conversation needs to be global, because at the end we are all affected to it. And I have to say, in UNESCO, we have China and we have the US. The US came back to UNESCO, and according to Secretary Blinken, he said it in the Congress, one of the issues was that we were running this ethics of artificial intelligence. Believe it or not, our recommendation bans social scoring and mass surveillance. It bans giving legal personality to AI developments. It calls about, and Zainab, I think that I never meant to give power to non-democratic governments. I meant governments have a role to play. And I want to just finish with one comment. Giving the voice to everybody, we are working with Microsoft. You are the co-chair of my business council, because this needs to be multi-stakeholder. But the responsibility is for governments and for the whole governments in the world. And I'm proud that UNESCO has brought all these countries together to discuss the issues. And you know what is the point that we get from these discussions with all the governments? Is how do we ensure that we invest more in good AI developments because we have been talking in this panel about controlling the downsides. How do we change this conversation to see what incentives we need to put in the markets to invest in the good developments? I have here Eugenio Bienbiel, who is, he has a fantastic platform of food intelligence, and he's always telling me, why are you always talking about the downsides? We're developing such a fantastic thing. Well, because like in any other market, the only difference is that this market is pervasive and touches upon all the other sectors, but it's a market where you can have the incentives for people to do right and avoid, and then when there is something going wrong, to really catch it up. But I feel that we have that at UNESCO already. 2 years, we're going to be reporting to our members now what has been the process. We're changing laws and regulations. And the real point here is that we need to invest in the capacities of governments also, because I think it's really important that they run these technologies for their own purposes, but also for creating these incentives.
Zaina.
So there are two very important things this question touches on. One of them is when you regulate something, think about cars, right? There's one level of regulation where you regulate what the individual car's brake does and whether it does that. But there's another question that cars bring, which is what kind of a society do you get with cars? When you get suburbs, when you get emissions, when you get climate change, that's a different level of regulation that you cannot get at by regulating the device itself. And given the way AI and large language models are going, it's clearly going to be impossible, even if we have very good regulations at the national level on the models themselves. They're not that hard for others to develop also. So other countries will develop them. There will be forum shopping. So that will happen. Because it's not like nuclear weapons. It's more like printing press, right? That's a sort of underlying technological thing. So what happens when it is possible for the societal things to happen regardless of your own, say, right respecting democracy is regulated? What you can do, and I believe we should do, is that we regulate our own outcomes ourselves. Right? Like, for example, clean air is a great example. It's something that affects everybody. Ideally, climate is something that is regulated globally. And if it's not, we have problems with climate change. But we still have really good clean air rules in most sort of Europe and US and Canada. And it's in Beijing and Delhi you can't breathe. Right? So those people are paying the price for not having the good local things. So for example, I don't think you can make facial recognition not happen technically. It's not that hard. But there's nothing stopping us from saying, here are the ways in which we are not going to allow corporations or governments to use it legally here. So we can protect our democracies from all sorts of technologies that we cannot stop from being developed, even if they forum shop, even if they don't. Like these, once again, we have to kind of accept the fact that they're not that hard to develop. But nothing is stopping. There's all sorts of things that other forums, other countries do. And that goes to the geopolitical thing that we do not do. And in the end, if you look at geopolitical tensions and Cold Wars before, it's the ones that provide the kind of life standard and freedom and liberty and equality and all that. Those are the ones that outcompete, not necessarily the ones that have blah, blah, blah technologies. The ones whose people live the way people want to live. Those are the ones everybody wants to emulate. Those are the ones people want to go to. And those are the ones that I think in the end is more important than who has more technological capacity in some subcategory of things.
Ian, maybe to that point.
It's a fascinating question. I really want democracies, functional democracies, to be the ones that perform the best. It is not clear to me that as AI becomes ubiquitous, that will continue to be the model. I mean, what we know is when we had the communications revolution, democracies were empowered by that. Authoritarian states were weakened, fundamentally so. We saw the colored revolution, we saw the Arab Spring, the former more successful ultimately than the latter. You have a data revolution, a surveillance revolution that's much more top-down, and it's much more empowering, both of corporations but also of authoritarian regimes, and it undermines democracies as it presently applies. Now we're talking about an artificial intelligence revolution, and I mean, looking 3-5 years out, I think there's a very open question. Number one, about whether a top-down closed society will be strengthened intrinsically by its ability to master AI and have more political stability accordingly, than the kind of governance that we end up getting in the West, which will be, better intentioned for citizens, but may well be severely flawed. Depending, it's an open question. Like we want it to be more in the direction of the UNESCO AI ethics, but we may not get there, right? And then the second question is about the economy, and a planned economy is really inefficient. A planned economy really falls apart. But is that true when a government is able to collect with corporations real time all the data that is I'm not sure about that. It might be that a planned economy becomes more efficient, and that this regulated free market thing that we have in different variants across the West may prove less efficient. I would hate that outcome, but I would not presuppose that the outcome I want is the one that we're going to have structurally here. And I think these are really big questions.
And I think that speaks also to the fear that many of us have faced with all of these things that are difficult to predict and understand, and we don't know their impacts on so much of what exists already and the divisions in the world now. Are there any other questions? Because we're kind of running out of time.
Hi, Bart Shevchuk at Covington & Burling. Thanks very much for a fascinating panel. My question sort of follows up on the previous exchange, which is, arguably when policymakers look at regulating AI, they're seeking to balance capability and control. In the United States, the balance is more tilted towards developing the underlying capabilities, and in Europe, arguably, it's towards developing control, maybe even at the risk of developing the underlying AI capabilities. Do you think that's fair? And to what extent do you think in Europe there could be measures to enhance AI capabilities so that, to Ian's last point, the democratic West can still maintain a leading edge on AI capability for the foreseeable future to come?
Yes. So I think there's huge differences within the EU between various governments. Some of them are more kind of tilted towards regulation, certainly at the level of the European Commission and the Parliament. But the French government, for example, is opposed to the current version of the AI Act. It thinks it too restrictive. The UK government, at least there was the impression up until the summit last week, that it was more concerned about existential risk and long-term risk. In fact, the discussion was more about sort of different strategies and short-term risks and the debate of open versus closed and things like that. So the reason the French government, as I mentioned earlier, is in favor of open source is because they see it as the only way for local sovereignty. If you want LLMs that integrate French culture and societal standards, then you have to have platforms that are open. The same reason why we have the open internet. And so that I think colors the opinion of certain governments, and I don't think the general opinion in the EU reflects necessarily European governments. We see the world being upside down. When I talk to the US government, there's a lot of talks about regulation. Talk to the UK government, a lot of talks about regulation. You talk to the French government, it's all about business.
Brad, please.
Yeah, the one thing I would add is it's always helpful to think about what someone is trying to achieve and then how they're trying to achieve it. And what I find interesting is a lot of these discussions about regulation start with a premise or maybe even a stereotype that Brussels is more heavy-handed than Washington. And like all stereotypes, it's born on some elements that reflect recent experience. But if you look at something like the AI Act, when I ask myself, what is it trying to achieve? What I answer is that fundamentally it's trying to ensure that all of the rights that the European Union has rightly spent so much energy developing and advancing over the last 30 years continue to be protected and promoted in an AI era. And so they focus on high-risk systems, and in many ways, high-risk systems are applications, actually, that have implications for the rights that they're most focused on, the right to privacy, the needs of children, the rights of consumers and the like. Then I look at what the United States, and especially the White House, has spent the last 6 months on. It's actually not those issues. It is fundamental concerns about safety and security. But I would go back to the fact that broadly, these are shared values and these are shared concerns. And so I think that there is going to emerge over time the ability to put these pieces together, and then you'll get into the questions of how. And that is where you tend to see more divergence in many instances. The role of the regulator, the specificity of the regulation, the very aspects of conduct that are being regulated. And those are going to have to be thought about and worked on. I do think at the end of the day, one question we should all ask ourselves is, do we want this technology to be interoperable, meaning it can move around the world? And then we should recognize, I think, that the technology will be interoperable only if regulations themselves are reasonably interoperable. And I think that's going to push governments, especially where they share values, to work harder to share more on the nuances as well.
Could I just say one word, because I agree completely with you? I think that they are converging. And the point now is not whether risk-based assessment or ex-ante assessment, but having the global conversation where we can learn together. And that's another angle where international institutions can provide these spaces to exchange.
In fact, perhaps your final thoughts, because we're run out of time. Zeynep.
So, I mean, I appreciate the concern about the technological development, but, I keep going back to history. The Soviet Union did not run out of tanks. It ran out of people who wanted to live there and wanted to rule it, right? The reason the Cold War ended wasn't some, catastrophic war where we technologically outperformed. It was that the quality of life was such that the people who ran the place did not want their children to live there. So when you look at AI, rather than focusing on, who has more compute power, whose decision does that, all of those things are interesting things to discuss. Where do you have the quality of life that respects, where people feel their privacy is respected, where their dignity is respected, where their democratic participation is valued, where key decisions about them on hiring, education, all those things are done in a way that are seen as fair rather than being, sort of manipulated. So I would worry more about what people in power will do with AI than who is going to have the more developed AI, because I don't think where the true competition is, and I don't think that's where the true competition has ever been. And that's what we should focus on rather than, the nitty-gritty, the technical nitty-gritty certainly matters, but if you don't have that North Star, I don't think it will deliver what we as people, as democracies would like to see.
And Ian, perhaps that's the issue, the intentions of people in power.
Completely agree.
You seem to be the only cynic on this panel. I'm absolutely struck by how hopeful you all are actually about, you're looking geopolitically and at the question of power and the impact it's going to have. But all of you have actually been pretty hopeful about where all this goes and its potential, and that it is more promise than peril. Is that, Stanley, is that for you the case?
Yeah, I mean, not only the symmetry of the institution, but also a symmetry of our connection. So basically, humans have very limited vision. So I think we need more wild imagination to see beyond. And because like pattern recognition basically is the fundamental part of intelligence, no matter it's human or machine. So we intend to see old pattern to predict a new future that meets all the limitations. Basically, we need something new, some bigger framework to bring all these people with different interests together to start a new conversation. So we're not trapped in old mindset. We're not trapped in old agenda. So I basically agree with Gabriela. I really think we need to tell a new story. So start from science fiction, I mean.
Can we, Ian? Is that something that's possible?
Can we tell a new story?
Yes.
Yeah, I think we can tell a new story. I do fundamentally believe in, sort of the willingness of human beings to be decent with each other. And I am hopeful. But my single biggest concern, I want to go back then to the opening comment I made, is the ability of these algorithms deployed with business models that are not aligned with what humanity is to dehumanize us. When I was a kid, my behavior was determined by nature or nurture. It was not determined by algorithm, right? That is now changing for our children in ways that we do not yet understand. And those models are being deployed on our children in ways that we do not yet understand. And I do believe, I completely agree with Zainab, that we've done this before. We've governed really complex things. The point is, and I would rather, frankly, a system where the governments are more in charge than the corporates. That's my bias, because they've just been doing it for longer, right? They've got more people that are oriented towards that. But I think that this is happening too quickly, with too many resources behind it, with too much impact on society, on the 8 billion around us, to allow for a full government solution, given where we are now. If we started 10 years ago, 5 years ago, maybe different, right? I'm being practical here. I'm not asking you, saying what I think I want. I'm saying where we are. And so in that regards, while I'm hopeful, I am not yet optimistic. Stanley and I, before this panel, were having, not a vodka, but we should have. We were having a little conversation talking about what we thought about the future. And we kind of aligned around this idea that we'd both come to separately. We'd never met before, though we've encountered each other publicly, I guess. That we kind of no longer think that we're likely to die of natural causes. Now, I was convinced that I probably would until about 3-5 years ago, and I'm hopeful that means I'm going to have a much expanded life expectancy because of the changes that we're now seeing. But I also am concerned that there's a much bigger fat tail that we just aren't going to be here in another 30, 40 years in the way that we think we are, given the technologies that are being unleashed and our limited capacity to govern proactively as opposed to following the crisis. I mean, we know how close we got to blowing ourselves up during the Cuban Missile Crisis. Right? And that should have been a no-brainer. Like, we understood mutually assured destruction and interdependence, and we still almost blew ourselves up. So what I see is a lack of sustainability of incrementalism. And I worry about that, but I'm hopeful. You're right, I'm hopeful.
Thank you so much, all of you. We could go on for much longer, and we've already over on our time by a good 10 minutes. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you.